Socialism and the erosion of natural rights and liberty. The ideological contest between socialism and capitalism has long defined modern political discourse. Socialists typically argue that wealth redistribution and state control are needed to achieve social justice and equality, whereas proponents of free markets insist on individual liberty and property rights. These positions reflect profoundly different understandings of rights and government. On the one hand, capitalism is often associated with the natural rights tradition, the idea, rooted in Enlightenment thought, that individuals possess inherent rights to life, liberty, property independent of any government. Socialists counter that an unregulated market leads to inequality and that collective ownership can better serve the common good. In practice, however, critics of socialism warn that socialist policies tend to empower the state at the expense of private property and personal freedom. As one analysis puts it, a capitalist critic might claim that socialism is about empowering authoritarian government agents to invade the rights of citizens and enrich themselves and their cronies. In this essay, I examine socialism through the lens of natural rights and constitutional order, how socialist doctrine and practice affect property ownership, labor, individual liberty, and the rule of law, and why these effects clash with classical liberal principles. Natural rights theory, life, liberty, and property. At the heart of liberal political philosophy is the concept of natural rights, fundamental entitlements that individuals hold by virtue of their humanity, not by grant of government. John Locke 1630–1704, a leading Enlightenment thinker, famously articulated a natural rights theory centered on life, liberty, and property. Locke argued that these rights have a foundation independent of the laws of any particular society. In his view, people are born equal and free, and only by mutual consent do they form governments to secure those rights. Crucially, Locke posited that property rights originate in an individual's labor. Every man has a property in his own person. The labor of his body and the work of his hands are properly his. When a person mixes his labor with resources from nature, he creates value that becomes his property. Thus, Locke holds that the fruits of one's labor belong to oneself, not to the state or to others, so long as there remains enough and as good left in common for others. Other classical thinkers echoed and expanded this idea of property as a natural right. William Blackstone, in Commentaries on the Laws of England, emphasized that the main purpose of society and government is to protect individuals in the enjoyment of those absolute rights which were vested in them by the immutable laws of nature. He described civil or political liberty as the condition where a person acts according to law only insofar as is necessary and expedient for the general advantage of the public. Any coercion beyond what is needed to prevent harm to others, Blackstone warned, amounts to a degree of tyranny. In other words, the state's authority must be strictly limited to safeguarding natural rights. It cannot justifiably override them. Locke's labor mixing theory also underpins the right to one's labor and earnings. Because individuals own themselves, the effort they expend belongs to them, and thus the results of that effort are theirs. Locke writes that when a person removes out of the state that nature hath provided something and mixes his labor with it, thereby makes it his property. This doctrine implies that even before formal government or law, people have presumptive claims to their person and work. John Locke's social contract envisions government as an instrument to protect these natural rights, not to confiscate them. If a government ceases to secure life, liberty, and property, Locke held the people could justly resist or replace it. Socialism's challenge to this view is profound. By subordinating individual claims to a collective or state claim, socialism often denies the absolute nature of private property. If, for example, all land and industry are declared state property, individuals' natural rights to the products of their labor are constrained. From a classical liberal perspective, any such subordination must be justified by consent and by real public benefit that outweighs the lost rights. Locke himself gave a condition: appropriation must leave enough and as good for others. But socialist practice frequently goes beyond Locke's sufficiency proviso, abolishing private control over key resources altogether. In so doing, socialism rejects Locke's premise that property rights are inherent and only secondarily subject to communal regulation. It instead embraces the view that property rights originate from social compact or government grant, which in effect makes them contingent. In contrast, natural rights theory treats property and labor rights as pre-political. This conceptual clash, whether rights are God-given or nature-given or state-given, lies at the core of the debate over socialism's legitimacy. Constitutionalism and natural justice. If natural rights are fixed and pre-political, what then of a written constitution or statutory law? Many modern governments enshrine rights in constitutions or legal codes. However, strict constitutional literalism, obeying the written text without regard to underlying justice, can in practice enable tyranny. Classical thinkers warned that a well-drafted constitution is not sufficient if it lacks moral grounding. As Montesquieu quipped, "There is no greater tyranny than that which is perpetrated under the shield of the law and in the name of justice." By this, Montesquieu meant that power can dress itself in legality while violating true liberty. Likewise, James Madison observed in the American context that experience proves the inefficacy of a Bill of Rights when majorities choose to override it. In a letter to Jefferson, Madison noted that repeated violations of these parchment barriers a Bill of Rights have been committed by overbearing majorities in every state. Rights on paper mean little if the political will to enforce them is absent. This insight undermines naive constitutionalism. Socialists might assert that because a constitution explicitly allows certain measures, those measures are legitimate, but without reference to higher principles, even egregious acts can be constitutional if the procedure is followed. Blackstone's natural law perspective offers a caution. The very aim of government is to secure immutable rights, so any positive law that violates natural law is invalid in substance. If a constitution rigidly grants the legislature unfettered power or lacks the means to check abuses, it provides only a paper barrier against tyranny. Indeed, tyrants from Julius Caesar to Stalin have used legalistic methods, emergency decrees, constitutional amendments, show trials, to cloak oppression. As Blackstone wrote, any wanton and causeless restraint of individuals beyond what is necessary and expedient is tyranny. Thus, a constitution that permits or enshrines socialist expropriation without regard to justice violates the natural rights foundation of law. In short, a democracy or republic governed by positive law still requires a moral compass. Constitutional text must be interpreted in light of natural justice, or else government can sanction grave injustice by procedure alone. Socialism's propensity for sweeping state power, if unchecked by natural law ideals, exemplifies this danger. When the state assumes ownership of all land and resources, such a move can be passed by vote or decree and thus be constitutional, but it can't escape the critique that it tramples the very rights that law is meant to protect. In the classical liberal view, any law that regulates and constrains our conduct beyond what is needed for public safety has no good end in view and is contrary to liberty. Socialists might counter that such constraints serve the common good. Liberals insist that without clear limits such claims justify the most extreme measures. The history of constitutions in socialist countries shows this vividly. Rights enumerated on paper meant little once the political revolution took hold, as we examine below. Socialism and the social contract. Classical political theory, from Hobbes to Locke and beyond, envisions government as arising from a social contract, in which free individuals consent to a limited surrender of liberty in exchange for security of their rights. Locke's contract, for instance, envisages individuals entrusting the legislature with power to make laws for the good of the people while retaining the consent that can always be withdrawn if rights are abused. In a free contractarian society, sovereignty ultimately remains with the people, and government exists by consent for protection of rights. Socialism, by contrast, dramatically reconceives this relationship. At its core, socialism posits that the state or the proletariat, or the people conceived collectively, should own and direct the means of production. This implies a very different theory of sovereignty. Rather than individuals transferring limited power to government, socialism often treats government and its ruling party as the expression of the collective will. The individual's role becomes subordinate to the perceived common good. This reordering has serious implications for individual autonomy. If the social contract is interpreted so that the state has a prior claim on all resources, then the individual's claim to property and, by extension, to the product of his own labor is conditional or entirely dependent on state allocation. The rule of law under socialism tends to be supplanted by loyalty to party or ideology. In practice, socialist states have shown that the declared sovereignty of the people can be a legal fiction. Real power is exercised by party elites and bound by meaningful legal restraints. Modern scholarship notes that socialist legal systems, i.e., socialist law, often concentrate all property in state hands, eliminate checks and balances, and use law as an instrument of policy rather than a limit on power. Indeed, under Soviet and Maoist regimes, the very notion of a contract between government and citizen was inverted. The citizen was expected to serve the state rather than the state serving the citizen. Further, socialism's emphasis on social rights such as the right to employment, housing, or welfare often comes at the expense of negative rights like non-interference and private ownership. While proponents argue that collective provision of goods is a higher moral order, critics warn that such positive rights cannot coexist with full private rights. After all, a right to guaranteed employment or free healthcare ultimately requires redistribution of others' property or labor. This tension between collective claims and individual rights breaks the classical liberal social contract. For example, under socialism, the idea that the state is the trustee of all land on behalf of the people effectively overrides any pre-existing claim by an individual owner. In Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, the president bluntly declared, "Land isn't private, it's the property of the nation. Land is, by nature, the property of everyone." Such pronouncements reverse Locke's presumption. Rather than property belonging to the laborer by natural right, it belongs to the state by ideological fiat. Once sovereignty is vested abstractly in the people, appeals to individual property rights become suspect. The rhetoric of socialism often treats them as obstacles to be overcome rather than foundations to be safeguarded. Finally, the rule of law itself is weakened under socialism's ideal of revolutionary change. Socialists often view pre-existing legal systems as instruments of the bourgeois order that must be overthrown. The revolutionary government claims a higher legitimacy, so it replaces rule-bound order with party directives. In such regimes, formal constitutions, if they exist, tend to proclaim rights while simultaneously granting the party a monopoly on truth and a democratic dictatorship, e.g., Mao's concept that trumps legal formalities. The tragic result is that the social contract dissolves. The government no longer remains a neutral arbiter of agreed rules, but an unchecked power that enforces one ideological vision. Individuals no longer contract with each other and with government as equals. They are to obey the state's high command. In effect, the original purpose of the social contract, mutual protection of rights, is abandoned. Economic calculation and the knowledge problem. Beyond theory, classical liberal critics emphasize economic arguments against socialism, even if one sets aside moral objections. Free market economists like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek demonstrated that central planning is infeasible in practice. Mises's economic calculation problem shows why, without private property and market prices for capital goods, planners lack the information needed to make rational production decisions. Mises argued that prices in a market economy encode the dispersed preferences and scarcities known only to myriad individuals. If the state takes ownership of the means of production, there can also be no market prices for them. Hence, economic calculation is literally impossible. The result is that a socialist planner cannot assess opportunity costs or compare alternative uses of resources. In Mises's stark phrase, what is called a planned economy is no economy at all. The paradox of planning is that it cannot plan because of the absence of economic calculation. In other words, central planning must grope about in the dark and cannot intelligently allocate resources. Hayek supplemented this critique with his knowledge problem. He emphasized that useful economic knowledge is dispersed among all individuals. The capital entrepreneur knows his factory, the farmer knows local soil conditions, the worker knows his own skills. Hayek argued that no central mind can gather all this knowledge of the particular circumstances of time and place, so socialism's fundamental flaw is an absence of knowledge in central planners. As one commentator explains, Hayek insisted that the only way to utilize dispersed knowledge is through decentralized decision-making and market prices, not through coercive aggregate planning. Without these signals, socialist economies inevitably misallocate capital, build too many hammers, too few screws, or send the wrong combinations of workers to plants. Even Hayek's hypothetical solution, that knowledge might be somehow communicated in a spreadsheet, faces the reality that preferences change constantly and cannot be centrally tabulated. These economic arguments are borne out by history. Capitalist economies, constrained by profit signals, tend to innovate and respond quickly to consumer demands. In contrast, historically all attempts to impose full socialism have encountered severe inefficiencies, shortages of basic goods, misdirected investment, black markets. The Soviet planners found this. Mao's Great Leap Forward led to famine. Venezuela's price controls created empty shelves. Many economists note that socialism lacks a mechanism for learning from errors. In a market, a bad investment simply fails and resources shift elsewhere, but in a planned system there is often no clear failure signal except chronic dysfunction. Thus, even ignoring moral stakes, socialism confronts a near impossibility. It must somehow replace the invisible hand of prices with some alternative method of information. The Austrian economists convincingly argued that such a replacement does not exist in principle. Socialist regimes and the erosion of rights. Historical lessons. Theory aside, history provides stark examples of how socialist policies have played out in practice. In every major socialist experiment, property and civil liberties have been deeply undermined. In the Soviet Union, the archetypal socialist state, the government proclaimed itself the sole owner of nearly all property. Encyclopedias note that Soviet law distinguished only two categories: socialist state or collective property versus a very limited realm of personal property, consumer goods, a house, a cow, and basic farm tools. By concentrating all land and industry in state hands, the regime effectively nullified independent economic institutions. As one scholar observes, this arrangement facilitated the long-term maintenance of power and privilege by the communist elite. The state confiscated churches, shut down independent media, and eliminated any private enterprises that could form a counterweight. The result was predictable. With no private capital and constant state interference, the Soviet economy stagnated while political dissent was crushed. Workers had no genuine right to change jobs, peasants were stuck on collective farms, and millions were sent to labor camps with virtually no enforceable legal rights. In short, the promise of equality under socialism was paid for by the abolition of fundamental rights, as Blackstone and Locke had warned would happen under unrestrained government. In Maoist China, a similar pattern occurred. Mao's revolution initially redistributed land to poor peasants in a bloody campaign that executed or punished millions of landlords. But this was only a first step. Soon the Communist Party converted those newly distributed lands into collective farms and people's communes, transferring property rights of the seized land to the Chinese state. Private plots were pooled. Individuals had no land title of their own. The state dictated all agricultural planning and procurement. As in the USSR, personal freedom and property were subsumed by the state's agenda. The result was disastrous. The Great Leap Forward's forced collectivization contributed to one of history's worst famines. During the Cultural Revolution, any personal ownership or opinion that contradicted the party line was an arrestable offense. Thus, in China, as in the Soviet Union, socialism's dialectic resulted not in the flourishing of the free individual but in a harsh dictatorship where tenants and serfs replaced independent farmers. More recently, Venezuela offers a cautionary tale in a modern context. In the early 2000s, President Hugo Chavez implemented 21st-century socialism through sweeping nationalizations and expropriations. Oil companies, factories, farms, and even television networks were seized by decree. Chavez infamously declared, "Land isn't private, it's the property of the nation. Land is, by nature, the property of everyone." Under this policy, many rural landowners had their estates confiscated without adequate compensation. Urban businesses also faced price controls and forced takeovers. Critics note that these moves were cloaked in the rhetoric of social justice, but they inexorably destroyed the rule of law. Property rights became utterly contingent on the regime's whims. As one commentator on human rights observed, whether one defends it or not, private property is an internationally recognized human right. The Venezuelan case illustrates that under socialism or populist regimes calling themselves socialist, speech and political rights soon follow property in being curtailed. Farmers who spoke out or tried to sell their harvest independently have been jailed. A free press and independent judges have all but vanished. Again, the de facto outcome is that the government confiscated not just land but the very ability of individuals to plan their own lives, in line with Orwell's warnings below. These examples are not anecdotes but patterns. In each case, a constitution or revolutionary manifesto guaranteed some rights, but state practice soon overwhelmed them. The constitutional order was subverted by ideology. Laws and constitutions became tools of the party, not protections of the individual. Montesquieu's insight that tyranny flourishes under the shield of law was borne out repeatedly. Socialism's promise of equality was achieved through state coercion, while natural rights were eroded. Scholars of comparative law note that socialist constitutions often look progressive on paper, voting rights, welfare rights, etc., but are routinely violated by political expediency. The lesson drawn by classical liberals is that concentrating economic power in the state inevitably leads to concentration of political power, since there is no separate sphere of civil society to check the rulers. Language, thought, and ideological control. Socialist regimes have also shown a predilection for controlling language and ideas, reminiscent of Orwell's dystopia. In 1984, George Orwell depicted Newspeak, a deliberately impoverished language designed to eliminate subversive thought. Newspeak's axiom was that by cutting down the vocabulary, one can limit unorthodox ideas. Today's ideological movements often censor or redefine language. Terms like freedom, capitalism, or even equality are loaded with propaganda. Orwell warned how a totalitarian state created Newspeak designed to limit a person's ability for critical thinking. Newspeak removes words like free, justice, or individual so that citizens literally cannot express or even conceive of them. In socialist contexts, this parallels how governments might criminalize terms like capitalist or frame all dissent as counter-revolutionary. Official slogans and euphemisms, for example, saying redistribution when meaning confiscation, or calling a forced labor camp a re-education facility, function like Newspeak to conceal oppression. More concretely, socialist propaganda often pits the collective good against the individual as if they were eternal enemies. Concepts of natural rights are ridiculed as bourgeois. In 1984, the party's reality control also meant rewriting history to fit ideology. Similarly, socialist regimes frequently rewrite historical narratives to demonize past market economies and celebrate only the party's achievements. This atmosphere of doublespeak and censorship ensures that citizens cannot fully articulate their own rights or grievances. The controlling ideology recasts property as for the people, dissent as imperialist interference, and arbitrary seizure as revolutionary justice. As Newspeak would have it, language is reshaped to prevent any notion of something like a natural right to property or liberty. When the very words for individual entitlement are taboo, the natural rights tradition is driven underground. Orwell's key insight remains: when the state monopolizes language and mythologizes its ideology, substantive rights shrivel. Under socialism, this has repeatedly occurred in practice: books banned, teachers purged, independent media silenced, leaving only the party's narrative for citizens to speak and think. Conclusion: liberty, enterprise, and constitutional order. In sum, when evaluated against natural rights principles, socialism's record and logic are deeply troubling. Natural law theorists like Locke and Blackstone envisioned a constitutional order aimed at preserving individual life, liberty, and the fruit of labor. Under genuine constitutional government, the law is a shield that restrains political power to its just sphere. In contrast, socialism in theory and practice has often expanded state power to a degree that nullifies private rights. Socialism's noble-sounding goals of equality and shared prosperity have historically been pursued by sacrificing the very institutions that secure justice and innovation. Capitalist individual enterprise, by contrast, operates under constitutional constraints that encourage voluntary exchange, protect personal freedom, and incentivize creativity. It is no accident that the most dynamic, innovative societies have been those that protected individual property rights and limited government intervention. The economist Friedrich Hayek famously argued that personal freedom, economic and political, is interdependent with rule of law institutions that cannot be erected in a command economy. In a free market, free speech society, people can propose new ideas and technologies, failing or succeeding by merit. No central planner can match this dispersed creativity. Moreover, a properly functioning constitutional order includes a safety valve for change. Laws can be amended or leaders replaced through democratic means when they overstep, but fundamental rights are protected against transient majorities. As Madison and others realized, rights are ultimately retained by the people, and only those limitations on liberty which are truly necessary for mutual security are justified. In the end, the natural rights critique holds that justice requires respect for the individual's claim to life and liberty as primary. This does not mean ignoring social problems, but it does mean rejecting any scheme that treats human beings as mere instruments of the state. Capitalism's defenders argue that progress and prosperity are maximized when individuals are free to use their talents and resources, a claim supported by history's data on wealth, health, and innovation. By protecting property rights and the rule of law, constitutional government provides the framework within which justice, productivity, and freedom reinforce one another. Socialism, by concentrating power, risks undermining these safeguards. For those who prize natural rights, constitutionalism, and individual initiative, the conclusion is clear. Only a system that respects private ownership and limited government can truly secure lasting liberty and justice. Sources: the arguments above draw on classical political thought, e.g., Locke's second treatise, and on modern analyses of socialism. Natural rights theory is presented as in John Locke and William Blackstone. Constitutionalists from Montesquieu to Madison warn that laws can be instruments of tyranny if detached from moral limits. Economic critiques of socialism come from Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. Historical evidence cites the Soviet and Chinese legal systems and policy statements of Chavez. Orwell's analysis of Newspeak is used to illuminate ideological control. These sources together support a defense of constitutional liberalism and private enterprise as the surest protection of natural rights and human welfare.